My guest today is Dr. J. Friedenberg, professor of psychology at Manhattan College, where he founded and directs the cognitive science program and where he had served as Department Chairperson for over a decade. Dr. Friedenberg is a vision researcher and has published articles on symmetry detection, center of mass decimation, and empirical aesthetics. In addition, he has written a number of science books. These include undergraduate texts in cognitive science, artificial intelligence, and nonlinear dynamics. He is also an artist focusing on pastel landscapes and urban sketching, and is serving his third year as president of the Haiku Society of America. We started the discussion with his book on Understanding Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts, an Interdisciplinary Approach, addressing the challenges in defining beauty, art, and creativity. After considering whether beauty is sensory in nature or more intellectual, we debated if beauty and art can be studied scientifically and addressed the role of intuition in art creation. The second part of the discussion moved toward technology. Since AI has found its way into the world of art for quite some time now, we looked at how it has already influenced the art industry. Is AI going to replace artists, or is there always going to be some human intervention required to create art? And if so, is the art ecosystem going to equally welcome both kinds of creation? Looking into the future, Jay shared his opinion on the role of AI in the art space in the next 10-20 years, debating who should own the copyright and what are the ethical implications of AI in creating art. Here is the show. Hello, Jay. It is nice to have you here with us today.
Happy to be here.
You wrote and published a book entitled Understanding Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Art, an Interdisciplinary Approach. Now, this is a set of very wide and complex topics. When and why did you decide to begin this ambitious journey?
I think for a couple of reasons. When I was younger, my father was an art collector. He collected pre-Columbian, Judaica, wide variety of different types of art. So I think I was exposed to art early on as a child, and it sort of piqued my interest. I'm currently an artist now, so I was more serious about it professionally a couple of years ago, exhibiting at galleries and so forth. I'm just sort of doing it now more as a hobby. I do paint pastel landscapes and do some digital work as well. In addition to that, I'm serving currently as the president of the Haiku Society of America, so I'm very actively writing haiku. So I'm a little sort of visual, but linguistic, both, I think, engaging in both modalities there. So I sort of like have a small amount of artistic talent, and I've really only been doing art seriously for the past couple of years. My training is like I'm a psychologist, so it's not really what I was doing most of my life, but I guess having experienced it early on, and then I sort of had some time later in my life to start exploring it, and it's now I'm hooked.
Yes, for sure. Different kinds of experience to look at this art world from many points of view. But how do you define beauty, art, and creativity? We enjoy this experience of art and often say it is aesthetic, right? And aesthetics, art, creativity are actually intertwined. But is gardening an art? How about algebra, mathematical proof, logic? Are they beautiful? Are they considered art? Can we even talk about the definition here? This is very, very hard to define. And if so, should we give up?
Well, I'd say no, let's not give up. Philosophers have been addressing, these three definitions for, ever since the ancient Greeks, and probably before that. We just don't have the records. And I think it's fair to say that these are controversial topics. They're ill-defined concepts. They're not, and there's a lot of debate about how you specifically define them, but it doesn't mean that people from different disciplines have been doing it. So for example, there's a recent book by Sartwell, 2012, who's the philosophy of aesthetics, where he outlines 5 conceptions of beauty. The ancient Greeks thought it was governed by rules. So things like symmetry and proportion and harmony. And so, they were adopting a sort of rule-based approach to what aesthetics might be. And then there's also another theme that sort of runs through some of the philosophers later in time with Plotinus and Shaftesbury, where they said it was that aesthetics has to do with the unity of parts. So like, it's sort of like this idea that you have parts that get assembled together into a whole. But if they are assembled together in a unified way, or in a way such that they come together well, that's connected to beauty. There's another theme that sort of runs through the philosophical literature on this topic. For example, Edmund Burke thought that the things that were beautiful elicited love or passion. So there's this idea of an emotional component, that when you are looking at a painting, you feel moved. For example, you hear a piece of music and makes you angry or want to cry. So there's this idea of, not just beauty, not just as perceptual, right? Like pleasing the eye and the ear, but also connecting to more to the soul in terms of like eliciting this type of emotional reaction. So that's aesthetics. Art, of course, and aesthetics are not necessarily exactly the same thing, right? Because art can be about many things other than just beauty. In fact, art recently, and if you look at postmodernism, art is a lot more about making a political statement, saying something about human nature, rather than beauty. In fact, we've sort of trended away from art as being about beauty. That was more of an old-fashioned notion, whereas art seems to service many other sorts of purposes now. But yeah, so there's been a lot of argument too as what art is. Plato, Tolstoy, Collingwood, Rand, there are a number of people who've all had different views on art, saying it has to do with, like, Tolstoy said it was the transmission of feelings, right? So going back to the notion of emotion. Plato said that art was the imitation of nature. So it's the idea that art is somehow reproducing or reflecting what exists in the natural world. And then Shimamura in 2013, he's got like a more contemporary model. He talks about like art is something that has to be created by a creator with an intent, right? There's this idea that you have a goal that you want to produce something, and then you create it, and then it's experienced by an observer or somebody else in order to have an experience. So it's sort of like the artist has a view of the world, and then wants to share that view of the world with somebody else through the piece, and the piece serves as like a mediator to sort of like communicate what the artist was trying to get across to other people. So art involves creation, right? It involves somebody doing something with the intent to produce a reaction in somebody else, and one of those reactions can be beauty, but it does not have to be necessarily.
So let's talk about this experience of the observer that you just mentioned. How exactly does it happen? And let's take beauty, for instance. Contemporary philosophers have debated whether beauty is sensory in nature or more intellectual. Do we draw the line here and say this kind of art or this kind of experience is more sensory and this one is more intellectual? Or are they intertwined? And if yes, to what extent?
I think they're all of the above. I mean, typically, you were talking about researching experience, and I tend to think of consciousness or subjective experience as consisting of several different components. There's the perceptual, so hearing, seeing, tasting, touching. There's the emotional. There's, happy, sad, surprise, etc. There is the cognitive, which consists of ideas and beliefs, and, which is more about information processing, but it's not like as value laden as emotion is. And I think art is all of those things, as well as spiritual. I think, it connects us to the spiritual. So, but you can, I think, to some extent differentiate between those. For example, you can look at decorative art, okay? Islamic geometric patterns, right? These beautiful patterns that you see in the Alhambra, for instance. Those don't have any semantic content to them, right? There's no figures, there's no characters or story that's attached to that type of art, but we wouldn't say that it's art. It's decorative, it's ornamental, so it's a type of art, but we wouldn't say that it's not art. And it engages us primarily at a perceptual level, right? So I think we can actually have art which is purely perceptual and is not activating the other parts of our brain that might respond to the emotional, cognitive, and the spiritual.
You mentioned art throughout history, and you talked about the factors that predict, for example, facial attractiveness, such as symmetry, averageness, and other factors. Are these individual factors, or are these actually aspects that are shared across viewers, across observers? Meaning, for example, music, right? In music, we have tempo and others. How many of these actually, and how they change with the stylistic and cultural shifts throughout time?
So I think you're talking about sort of the difference between universals and particulars that Aristotle got at, and you certainly see that in the art world. There's huge individual differences. In fact, in empirical aesthetics, this is one of the problems in doing this kind of research, is that you show a pattern to one person and they, on a scale of 1 to 7, somebody gives it a 2 and somebody else gives it a 7. So without a doubt, you have individual differences which are shaped by culture and experience, but by the same token, there are universals in art. So for example, the work on facial symmetry, the work, that's a universal finding. So when we're talking about biological beauty in particular, right, we're talking about evolutionary selection pressures, which have probably acted cross-culturally on the human species. And so those sorts of things tend to show up no matter what country, for example, you might be testing in. So I think you see both of those things in art. There are certain kinds of art that everybody resonates to, right? And everybody appreciates in the same way because our brains are hardwired that way. And then you also have great individual differences. So it sounds contradictory, but both of those are the case. Faces are perhaps the best example of that, because we evolved in terms of sexual selection to find certain kinds of faces attractive because they signal things like immunocompetence or other, adaptive traits, and things like symmetry, but also averageness. So, for example, if you morph a set of faces together, and you blend, like you can create like a blend in Photoshop, that average face is judged as more attractive than any of the single individual faces that make it up. Right. So, and that's because it's in the middle of the gene pool. And when environmental conditions are stable, which they typically are, according to the theory, you want to mate with somebody who's not at the extreme of the gene pool, right? Who has a big nose or eyes that are smaller than average. The average signals that it's like adaptive. So you see that with a lot of other examples in faces, like contrast, sexual dimorphism, things like that. And those tend to be universal, right? Then you're going to see, not things that aren't involved specifically like in survival or reproduction, that is in natural or sexual selection. You're going to see more individual variation.
Science has focused more, traditionally at least, on the commonality of experience and not so much on the specifics, meaning the specific features of each individual, and also the specific components of the perception of the observers. Now, can beauty and art be studied scientifically? Can we evaluate them empirically?
Absolutely. They certainly can. And there's an entire field that's devoted to it. It's called empirical aesthetics. There's an International Association of Empirical Aesthetics, IAEA. This is a society that's been hosting a conference every 2 years. Their first conference was in 1965. They have several journals in this area. There's one called Empirical Studies in the Arts. There's another American Psychological Association journal. It's called The Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts. And so there's this whole area, and it's interdisciplinary. It's not just psychology. It's people from neuroscience and philosophy and even architecture and graphic design and commercial marketing, things that you see all kinds of people that are in this field. And they design experiments to test what it is that people find beautiful or sublime and so forth. So, it doesn't, just because you have individual differences doesn't mean it can't be studied scientifically. You actually study the individual differences as well.
You mentioned the role of intention in creating art. How about the role of intuition? Is intuition a required component for a more expressive and healthy creative process or not?
Yes, intuition for sure. It's interesting because here we get now into the cognitive. There's the Gestalt psychologists. I don't know. I'm sure you're familiar. They had these stages of problem solving and incubation. Kohler and Kafka. They talked about insight learning. So, right, you give even an animal like an ape a problem to try to get the banana, and there's initial attempts at problem solving. Then there's some sort of period of incubation, and all of a sudden you have this aha moment where the animal figures out how to get the banana. And there's many examples of this in human problem solving and creativity as well, where people try to do something, fail, they wait a little while. And the idea is that their subconscious mind is working on it. And then it takes some time to percolate up into conscious awareness. But then when it does, boom, you have this insight moment and you immediately realize what the solution is, and then you apply it. As a cognitive psychologist, that's what I would say intuition is. It's subconscious information processing. It's just our brains doing something that we don't have awareness of or access to at the moment. But that doesn't mean it doesn't influence the way we create art, right? Or the way we solve problems. It's always there in the background. And, art, of course, there's this famous saying, Basho, who was one of the founders of one of the original Japanese founding fathers of haiku. And he said, first you have to learn the rules, and then you learn how to break them. Right. So this is right. Like, I always thought that this was like wonderful advice for the artist, right? Because you can't start off art like not having the structure and the teaching and the understanding and stuff. But the really interesting stuff about art is when you start to apply the intuition after you know what you're doing, right? And the intuition, I think, comes to a large extent in how you break the rules. Because the art, what really makes art interesting is not so much how you follow, how you connect the dots in terms of how to execute art the way it's supposed to be done. You interpret art individually in your own way, and that's breaking the rules. And people do that using their own intuition. They do it in very different ways, and that's what we like about art. It's like you look at 100 different artists, and they're going to interpret something 100 different ways.
So in this case, how do we study it scientifically? Because we, a long time ago, separated intuition from scientific method. How do we evaluate it then?
Intuition is not separate from scientific method. There are people who study subconscious processes. For example, you can do MRI analyses, like we talked about the incubation period. So give somebody a problem, and then what's happening in their brain when they're actively trying to solve it, and when you have them perform some other task, or when they're just doing nothing. And you could see the different parts of the brain would get activated during the subconscious period. So I would say that, if you define intuition this way, then it certainly can be studied. Just because we don't know what's going on. There was this classic study on free will that was done. I think this guy's name was Libet. Like, where we make a decision and we're only aware that we make the decision after we've already made the decision. He was doing brain imaging, and he found that I think it was prefrontal cortex and certain other parts of the brain actually activated before people were consciously aware that they made the decision. So it's almost like their brain made the decision for them, and then after the fact, we take responsibility for it.
Yes, the field of neuroscience definitely has looked into this. I was referring to other sciences, well, in particular technology, but it's true, yes, and they cannot be fully separated. So your book says explicitly that an interdisciplinary perspective is very important when studying these intertwined areas. Why is it important to look at beauty, art, and creativity from an interdisciplinary perspective?
Well, because they're such complex phenomenon, and as you said before, they're intertwined and related to each other. And I think whenever one is studying a complex phenomenon, it has to be done interdisciplinarily. Because if you just adopt one approach, you might figure out one aspect, but you won't figure out everything. So, there's this old adage of the blind men, four or five blind men. I think it's 4 blind men and the elephant, right? And so here's this elephant and the blind men. How do they know what it is? Well, one of them feels the tail and he says it's a broom. and another one feels the trunk and says it's, I don't know, something else, and someone feels the leg, and they all, and each one of them thinks it's four different objects. But then if they all come together and they like share what they experienced, then they realize that it was an elephant. And I think that that's true here, that like if cognition, neuroscience, philosophy, AI, robotics, all of these fields, I think, need to come together for us to understand anything that's complicated, not just art, aesthetics, and creativity, but anything, like the human mind, particularly. That's why cognitive science has emerged as an interdisciplinary approach.
Yes, technology for sure. So this is a very good transition for us to move to the next question. AI has found its way into the world of art for quite some time now. In fact, it has started in the 60s. There have been also awards like the Lumen Prize dedicated to art created with technology. How has technology, and in particular AI, influenced the art industry? Specifically, is AI going to replace artists, or is there going to be some human intervention always required to create art? And if that's the case, is the art ecosystem going to equally welcome both kinds of art creation?
Yeah, a very good question for the future. And in fact, it's happening even now as we speak. Technology is having a huge impact on the arts. Not all artists like that. Some artists like the hands-on, brush and paint effect, and they don't like the technology. But some, especially the younger generation, they love technology. There's a huge industry creating animated films, companies like Pixar, where you create everything on a computer. All the art is created on a computer. You have 2D and 3D models. In filmmaking, I mean, look at Avatar, where you have motion capture. So I think we're going to see, and we have been seeing, a trend where films are using motion capture more and more to create artificial effects. Games, and we're already at the point where we can't tell the difference in some of these games and simulations, whether it's a real person or not. I'm looking at you now on Zoom, and it's a fairly low resolution image of your face. Maybe you're not real. Maybe you're a simulation. This is getting a lot of attention now in terms of deep fakes, right? There's a Tom Cruise deep fake that's out there where he's performing a magic trick. And so, I think the next big trend in art and technology is going to be VR, and both virtual reality and also augmented reality. So in VR, you put on the goggles, you have this whole body experience. It's really much more satisfying and immersive because it involves not just like audio or video, but you can interact with these worlds. You can move objects around, talk to people. And so VR has tremendous potential, I think, for the future of the art world. There's art, for example, there's already an application called Tilt Brush that Google put out that allows users to create like 3D virtual spaces. So people can actually right now, anyone for free, can actually create their own 3D VR art. And if I were to predict where, what the trend is going to be going forward, I'd say that's it. The other part of your question was AI and AI creating art, like completely independent of people. And there's been many attempts to do this. Harold Cohen created Aaron. That was the first program to use a robotic arm to actually paint things. There's a more modern version called Ada, which did an exhibition at London's Design Museum. But all of these require now extensive human input. In fact, I remember even there was a play. They did an artificial intelligence play that was produced in the United Kingdom. But all of these examples are not just a machine generating it de novo, like from scratch. They all involve tremendous human input in conjunction with algorithms and so forth. So right now, that's the sort of art that we're creating. It's sort of like the interaction of human and machine. But that does not mean that 50 years from now or less, we could get to the point where we would have art that would be generated completely autonomously and independent of human input. So that's certainly a possibility.
Yes, you talk about VR, these virtual spaces that so many people and companies are interested in today. The idea behind this is to give viewers an entirely new way of experiencing the world, art including, that transports them into this experience space without having to leave our computers or these tools that allow us to interact in these virtual worlds. But doesn't this imply a full understanding of human experience? So in order to create these art spaces in virtual world, don't we have to understand human experience to its fullest before we do that? What is the upper bound on this? Because you said that, who knows, in the future, computers might be able to do this on their own.
Well, I would have to ask what you mean by human experience, because, for example, when we sketch a building, we are looking at the building, we're perceiving it, and we have an image of it in our visual memory, and then we're able to reproduce that motorically using pen and paper. So that's a process. I mean, that is a definable process. That process can be replicated. I think almost any artistic process can be replicated. What the question is, consciousness is subjective experience. So can we develop a machine that can experience happiness when they're listening to happy music or watching a ballet? That's the real issue. But really, it's a technical question of whether or not you can reproduce different kinds of art. I mean, let's use the example of music composition. If we understood very well how music was composed, if we understood it from an algorithmic point of view, from probabilistically, if we could define it well enough, we understood the rules governing that process, then we could replicate that process. I know what you're getting at. You're getting at this idea of artists are emotional, they have values, they want to express those values. We talk about art as artists having a soul, and they want to, can you give a machine a soul? Can it do that? I would equate soul with consciousness. And so that's a separate issue, because when it comes to AI can do anything a person can do if we can just understand how it's done, right? That's procedural. The sticking point is in, can you imbue a machine? Can a machine evolve or develop subjective experience the same that a human does? And if it can, and it can do the art, then it could imbue its experience into the art. But whether that's possible, I'd say it is possible. I would say that it's not impossible for a machine to develop consciousness. I think that's something that, as these things become more complex, I know it's a separate discussion of what consciousness is, but there's certain prerequisite criteria for consciousness. Like, I think you need, like, we have brains in a body, and then we experience the world, and that, I think, is what produces consciousness in us. I think we're born with it to its tiny degree, but we mostly develop it through interaction with the world. So I think if you could put the right kind of computer in like a computer in a robot, and have that robot interact with a complex dynamical environment, over time, given other certain requirements, consciousness might emerge. So yeah, it's possible. And then, train that entity to do art, and then maybe it could put its soul into its art.
Yes, I didn't have consciousness in mind when I asked the question, although it's a very, very good, valid question. And many people have thought about it for quite some time now. We don't actually know if that will ever be possible. Some people do believe that. I was thinking more in terms of human experience, in the sense that we interact with the world through our senses, and we use most of the time most of our senses to really make sense of the environment around us. My question was more about the role of the senses in immersive experience that we're trying to create in these virtual spaces.
Yeah. Well, perception is actually one of those things that's fairly well understood from an algorithmic point of view, right? I mean, we already have pattern recognition. We have software that can identify faces with greater accuracy than humans can. There are computers that can recognize a Duchenne smile, which is like a fake smile, at 100%, near 100% accuracy, whereas people can only detect it with like 85% accuracy. So, yeah, I mean, Experience is certainly necessary for art. There's no question. So like if someone was to write a novel, how could you write a novel without having your own life narrative, right? You would need to draw on the stories that you experienced, right, in order to create your own story. But there's been software that's been written that writes novels. Selmer, I might be mispronouncing his name, it's Bringsjord, and he's the first to do this. And there's other people that have followed up, and they've created software that writes novels, that have written entire novels that people read, and you can sometimes have it's almost like a literary Turing test where people read it and they can't tell the difference between whether it was generated by a machine or a human. So what they're doing though is they are imbuing narratives into the software, right? They're teaching the software things like plot, character development, location, foreshadowing, so they have to teach it about how to write a novel, but then they also have to give it real world experience, right? They have to give it narratives. It's very difficult to create a novel narrative without understanding how narratives work. So that's experience, right? You have to have experienced the world in order to do the art. But they're putting a simulated experience into it, right? It's simulated. It's not real experience.
Yeah, it's true. So technology gets better and better every day. And indeed, we have very good facial recognition software these days, but it's most of the time stripped of context. And what I mean by this is that we still don't know how the senses interact with each other. And this is very, very important in designing this immersive experience in VR spaces. Cognitive scientists have studied perception for a long time now. When it comes to AI, we still don't know how to model it. And in fact, historically speaking, the fiction writing tools, the AI fiction writers, have indeed tried to simulate how we write novels and so on. But current technologies such as transformers can do this without really knowing how to write fiction. So they bypass our process. But we'll see where the future actually takes us. Now, if artificial intelligence is used to create paintings, write fiction, can the final product really be thought of as art? Is algorithmic art really art? And here, it really comes very important to define the criteria that should be used and who should be the judge. I'm not sure if the audience can tell the difference, at least not all the time. For example, photography was first invented in the early 19th century, but it wasn't considered art, at least not at the beginning. Why is AI different today?
We talk about AI creating art algorithmically, but aren't we algorithmic? I mean, when we paint a painting, that's a process, that's a procedure. Our algorithms, our procedural knowledge has been programmed in by experience, or it's selected for by evolution. So we are creating, if you think of art purely as a behavior, right? As just an action that is being carried out in an understandable way, then there's no difference between AI and human art. I think that's the point that I keep getting back to. If you remove the subjective experience from it, you strip that out, then we are also robotic. We're robots that are just performing things according to, maybe difficult to understand algorithms. So, for example, you could have an algorithm that you can make somewhat random by adding in probability functions, right? So it doesn't have to be completely determined, just if X, then Y. You could have randomness programmed into the algorithm, so that there's always a degree of variability and unpredictability in the type of art that is produced. So is that randomness, is that any different from us? I mean, we generate human beings are capable of generating quasi-random behaviors, and they can be generated mathematically. So I'm not sure that an AI generating art, at least from this perspective, it would be no different than a person generating art.
I have to say that I do not have much experience with paintings. I'm not that kind of artist, but I do have experience with creative writing and fiction. And different writers use different creative processes. So, for example, some of them believe in coming up with an outline first before starting to write. Others believe that it should come to you without really planning ahead of time. I don't know who's right and who's wrong. There are obviously different ways of doing it. But where exactly do we draw the line between what AI can produce and what the human can produce?
Right now, I think the line is blurring, and it has been blurring as technology develops. And, it's interesting because people consider art to be somehow like the last bastion of humanity, and that if a machine can reproduce art, then that's it, like we just cash in our chips and give up. But, if you could say, is art any different than any other action? So some people argue, in fact, there's people in the empirical aesthetics movement who say that art is not any different than doing anything else. It's just, it involves behavior, emotion, thought, creativity. Well, aren't you doing those things when you're solving problems, when you're talking to people? Is there something special about art? I would argue that there is something special to aesthetics. I think that having an aesthetic experience, if you can identify particular brain areas and so forth, and you can differentiate those patterns of activity from what activates, when you do other forms of activity. So I think there's an argument to be made that art is similar, but also different from other things. And, the appreciation of beauty in particular might be sort of part of that major difference.
In 2018, there was an event which took place, and that created quite a debate in the field. A group of French artists created an AI that painted a portrait of a person called the Portrait of Edmond Bellamy. And the idea was to feed thousands of portraits into this AI algorithm and to teach it the aesthetics based on past examples of such portraits. The outcome, I actually looked at it. It's rather intriguing, to say the least. But is that art? What do you think?
I think that procedurally it might be art, but I think it lacks the feeling component. It lacks the experiential component because it is purely algorithmic. And whether or not experience is an algorithm itself, or is there something special about it? And when we talk about algorithm, it's just a level of description, right? An algorithm is just a sort of, it's a formalization. It's just a description of the way something works. It's not the same thing as what's actually happening, right? So you could describe a pattern of brain activation algorithmically. You could define what's a computer circuit algorithmically. So it's a level of abstraction, right? But maybe brains are the only things that can feel like that we know of right now. You would have to have a brain in order to feel. And if feeling is necessary for the production of art, and machines can never do that, then they can never create art. So I think it stems upon that. I think ultimately we're going to be able to get technology to reproduce all human capabilities. In fact, I teach a course on artificial psychology. And this is sort of the question that we examine, okay, here's all the things that people can do. They can use language, they can walk, they can grasp objects, blah, blah, blah. And let's look to see if we can synthetically create devices and things that can perform these actions. It's basically, you look at the list, a lot of things have been crossed off. The list is getting smaller over time. So in terms of being able to reproduce human behavior, yes. If art is considered a behavior and we can reproduce human behavior, then we could probably reproduce art. But AI also does a lot of other things that are interesting. For example, maybe things that are even beyond human level capability. For example, a colleague of mine, is actually working on a soft program to determine the provenance of paintings. And obviously this is of enormous import in our community, because let's say a Jackson, this happened, like a Jackson Pollock comes up. Is it a fake? Well, if it's a fake, it's worth nothing. If it's real, it could be worth like $150 million. So we can create algorithms that do what are called image statistics. So they scan the image and they look at the skew of the luminance distribution and they look at the power laws. You just basically taking pixels, looking at the deriving statistical parameters of the image just based on things like brightness value, colors, and stuff like that. And actually, those things can go a long way towards determining whether or not this is a fake, this painting is a fake or not. Yeah, so like the hand of the artist, right? The signature of the artist is a unique style, but it's something that can be, obviously that people can learn, they're experts that can do this, right? But they're trying to replicate that also in terms of, and try to make it even better than human level capability. So it's interesting, just as a sort of aside, that there's AIs that are doing things other than just producing the art, right? They're trying to determine whether or not these things are genuine or not.
Yeah, right. So talking about this provenance of a piece of art, in fact, there are people who believe that the only way AI can make a positive impact on the art world is to help find the origin of a piece of art, also can find stolen artworks in this process. Is there any danger in AI de-incentivizing actual human creation and creativity then?
I don't think so. I don't think so. In fact, I think people are always going to appreciate works that are created by people. And I don't think that, and not to say that there's not going to be a market for AI generated art. I think there will be, because that's also of interest to certain types of people. But I think that actually in an era going forward where we are mechanizing and automating these sorts of things, the human hand might actually become more valuable, right? Because furniture, chairs can be mass manufactured at very low cost, but many people prefer antique chairs that were made by hand, right? Because it's the product of a human hands and a human mind. I think if anything, AI is probably going to, people knowing whether a person did it or not is sort of the crucial difference, right? I think you can look at a work of art and if you're just evaluating it purely on perceptual characteristics or whatever, there's no question there. But like, if it comes down to like, was this created by a person or not by a person? I think most people prefer the human generated art because we are humans, because we know what it's like to be human, because we appreciate these kinds of skills that other people have. In fact, Ayn Rand had a theory of art, which is the romantic theory of art, which is that, an artist, when they created art, they have a value. So they value something about the world, and their art represents that value, so that when it's looked at or observed, that value is decoded and then represented and understood and appreciated in the mind of the observer. So our tastes in art are to a large extent about shared values, right? So, if somebody likes color, they're going to like colorful paintings. If somebody likes art that's about the struggle for freedom, they're going to appreciate art that shows that semantic content, right? If someone has an interest in war or military subjects, they're going to like art which shows paintings of battle scenes and so forth, right? So the content matter, the values, the ethics, all of these things that get passed on through the art and appreciated through the art. And I think we like art because of that value, because we know an artist had a value and then we're sharing that value. It sort of connects us. The art is almost like a medium that connects us to the artist in a way. You could think of art almost as like a love affair with the artist. Are you falling in love with the art or are you falling in love with the artist? Right?
Right.
And of course, sometimes, what's that saying? Never meet your heroes. So I loved Beethoven until I saw this film on Beethoven. Apparently, he was a real jerk. Wow. So I don't know. I'm not so now. And now, having known that, I appreciate Beethoven less because I know he was a human, right? Yeah. I appreciate the emotion that went into his art, but the way he treated other people in his life makes me actually appreciate his art less because I know he's a human. And you could never do that with a machine, right? That wouldn't happen with a machine.
It's true. And he is not actually an isolated case. In fact, there are many personalities, actors, artists, entertainers who are absolutely amazing at what they do. But in real life, they are, interesting people, to say the least. But I don't know. I do appreciate their art in general. You're right. It's hard to really differentiate the human from the artist. Going back to AI and connecting to the artist, right? Can we even say that we can connect to the AI artist? Like this individual robot with feelings and personality. How do you see the role of AI in the art space in the next 10, 20 years? Well, I'm not sure if we're going to have robots like this in the next 10, 20 years, but how do you see it?
I see as we talked about before, I see virtual reality. So there's a difference between AR and VR. Augmented reality is sort of like an overlay, right? So, you have goggles or you have contact lenses and information about what you're looking at pops up. So you could imagine artistic AR where you have overlays that are modifying what you're seeing. So you're walking down the street and you're looking at a building, there's practical purposes. So you're looking at a building and it tells you that jeans are on, a skirt is on sale or whatever. And so you can go in there. But like, what's to stop you from turning that building into like a Monet? Imagine looking at the entire world through an artist's eyes, right? That's what augmented reality could give you. Like if your favorite, let's say, I don't know, Monet is your favorite artist, right? Imagine seeing the entire, actually they did this. It was a film about Van Gogh where the whole film was done in the style of Van Gogh. It was an anime. They sort of did animated overlay, I think, on top of actual video. And it was really quite beautiful. It was almost like you were seeing the entire world through Van Gogh's eyes. So that would be an example of how you could use augmented reality because it's taking what you see and it's changing it. VR is creating a whole different reality, right? One that may or may not correspond to what actually exists. And I think both of those are going to be the future of art because they're so immersive. And it's also another interesting point. I think the most immersive artworks are the ones that engage all five senses. So you think about eating and sex are the two things that engage all five senses, and they're the most satisfying experiences, right? Because those are things we hear, see, taste, touch, and smell. And VR can do that, right? Because you have the whole bodysuit, you could simulate tactile, haptic, you can do all five senses. So it's kind of scary. If people are addicted to the internet now, what's it going to be like, when it becomes so completely immersive? People are going to put these suits on and they're never going to want to take them off.
If AR or VR can allow us to modify our experience the way we want it, let's say, or others would want us to experience the world, what are the ethical implications here? Is this good or bad? Right? I mean, I would like to see the world most of the time with pink glasses, right? To see Monet on buildings and so on. But obviously, this can also be taken to the extreme and it can be also used for not so ethical purposes.
Oh, yeah.
What are the ethical implications of this in the art world?
My response to this question is that technology is a tool. It can be used for good or ill. You can use technology to, make food for people. You can use it to build atomic bombs. Any technology is something that's created right now, is something that's created by humans and it's used by humans. And it can be put towards positive or negative ends, right? So you could use VR systems to fool people. I mean, right now, look at all the misinformation and disinformation that is spreading online, generating conspiracy theories. Those are because there's the bad actors out there, right, that are doing that. That's not the technology. That's the humans who are using. That's the humans who are using the technology and the ones who are reacting to it. So the humans are the problem there, not the technology. And we need to make people need to be more ethical, and they need to create ethical technology. One example in VR is VR journalism. And so they've done simulations of the military base at Guantanamo Bay to raise awareness of how the prisoners were being treated there. There was also a VR simulation of the Syrian civil war. So that you walked through and you got to experience what it was like to have a bomb blow up and see dead children on the street. And I think those experiences are very powerful because they can enhance empathy. When we're getting the news right now, we are getting it in an abstract sort of way. We read about the war, but we're not there. Imagine if you could actually be there. So, this might be one way of making us more human, making us more empathetic and concerned about other people. But you could see it's going both directions, right? It's like it's being used to spread falsehoods about vaccines, and it's, to get, and then that's having all kinds of devastating consequences. So it can go either way. As far as art goes, I think the same thing is true. Art can be almost anything you want it to be. And I think people can appreciate AI, machine generated art. I think some people don't. And it's just now, just like you have an individual creates art and someone might like it or not like it. So is it any different than that? I see that we have to be ethical about the way we use technology. And if we're using technology for artistic ends, that there's no difference there, right? We could use art to influence people. Plato thought that art was dangerous because you could incite the populace to revolution. If you look, and art now is being used for political ends, right? But that's politics. That's really not so much art as it is the users of the art. And they're like Russia's Internet Research Agency. They're paying people to spread lies and propaganda. They influenced the 2016 election. They influenced the Brexit outcome vote. I mean, all this stuff it's been shown. So you have bad actors, right, who can use art to influence public opinion and people's understanding of world events, and then can bring down democracy. On the other hand, you can use art to make people understand one another better and to share experiences and to make the world a better place. So I think when it comes to technology and art, it's no different than technology and any other field.
Yes, true. And these empathic, immersive technologies are becoming better and better every day. But as you said, there are always two sides. It really depends on which one do we pick to focus on.
Yeah.
We are at the end of the show today, but I have one more question for you, if you don't mind. Let's talk about the pandemic a little bit. Many museums have closed their doors because of this and shifted the exhibitions from in-person events to online-only experiences. Do you believe that this is a temporal shift? And if yes, when is the end of it?
Right. I don't think it's going to supplant the in-person experience of art. I mean, when you're in a museum and you see that painting in front of you, you have a very different experience than when you're looking at an image on your computer screen. When you're sitting or you're listening to an orchestra play a symphony and you're seeing those players, that's very different from listening to it over your headphones. Of course, art can be experienced virtually. I mean, there's no question. You're reproducing the sensation, the perception, and people can respond to that. But when it's direct and immediate and right in front of you, and especially when you see it's either the product or, in the case of the performative arts, the actual real-time execution of the art by people, it's much better appreciated. And in fact, I do think I remember a study where they looked at that. They looked at the same artwork and they look at it in a museum, you look at it online, you look at it, under various conditions, and people generally, I think, responded more favorably when it was experienced in actuality. So yeah, in fact, the whole reason we go to see dance and music is because it's a performance, right? It's the actual people, that are doing this. And theater, right? You have the actors, they're right there. I think theater is more compelling than cinema, in part because those are real people in front of you. That they're real. Not that we can't experience and appreciate art virtually, we certainly can, but I think that doesn't mean that the art experienced in real time is going to go away. I don't see that happening.
Yes, there are aspects of human interaction that no matter what we do, no matter how well we design this technology, will never be able to be simulated virtually. We still miss the face-to-face direct connection with other people, for sure. So how can our audience learn more about you, your books, and your research? And how can you be reached?
Well, if you're interested in art, I do have a website. It's called bigapplearts.com, just all no spaces, dashes, anything, just bigapplearts.com here in New York City. I've got some, my pastel landscapes. I've got some digital graphic design work, digital paintings and things up there. If people are interested, they could take a look. My haiku is online as well. So published in a lot of haiku journals, but I had a tweet. Actually, for a while, I was tweeting haiku. So if you want to look me up, I think it's Haiku Man is my handle on Twitter. Or if you just do a search for my name, it should come up, and there's some examples of my poetry up there. And my books are on Amazon. So if anyone is interested in the aesthetics book or the digital self book, that's all on Amazon.
Thank you for your time, Jay. This was great.
Oh, I enjoyed it very much. It was a pleasure.
Likewise.